community.org. So this is basically the people who have been arguing for multiple standards and arguing for inserting RAND clause in the electronic document policy. So they give this example saying that, for text encoding, we have different standards: HTML, PDF, RTF, ODF. And now there is a new standard that has come up, which is not an open standard according to us, but nevertheless a standard approved by the ISO. So they argue these are multiple standards for performing a single task, namely to represent complex documents. Since they exist and all of them are declared standards, government must allow multiple standards. So that's their argument. So they also give some nice metaphors to convince people. So they say that we have different kinds of vehicles, like fire engines, ambulances, police cruisers, prisoners, vehicles, and things like that. And then say, similarly, open file formats mean many things to many people. And one document format cannot address the list of needs that arise in the multitude of scenarios in which documents are created and used. And so they say that just as an ambulance isn't an optimal choice to clean streets, and a show plow isn't useful to transport commuters to work, the reality of software usage today suggests that many, many file formats exist to satisfy the incredible diversity of needs in software applications. So this is what a commercial company does. They use all their creativity in creating as many, multiple expressions as possible, because that is what is being taught by the MBA graduates, that you have to package your property. You have to, distribute it in packages, and that's what happens. So they're confusing us. They're providing misleading metaphors to convince the need for multiple formats. It is indeed possible to write a paragraph, an essay, book, or an encyclopedia using the same simple editor that we use. And I'm particularly a fan of an editor called GNU Emacs. I write most of my thoughts, all my work, in simple plain text. I can actually do presentations as well in simple plain text. And I make the computer present to you in a slide format of a simple plain text. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. So I'm not using the powerless point presentation. I'm using an open document format, which is actually written in plain text in XML. And so this is one of those examples. But I could have actually used even GNU Emacs to create a PDF document directly out of it. Now the reason why I'm especially mentioning Emacs is this is one application which encodes everything in plain text and does all jobs related to text manipulation, including programming as well as communication. So what does it mean? On one hand, you have free software community, which is putting all their creative work to do everything in plain text. And on the other hand, you have the proprietary community, which is trying to create private languages, and their effort is basically to create hard stones. And that's how all our culture is going to be lost. And that's basically the message that I want to tell you. So where do we put our innovation? We need innovation to keep it simple. In fact, the more complicated we make, particularly our writing methodologies, we're going to lose it. So we need to standardize simple things, not complicated things like OOXML. They also talk of freedom. In fact, in the same document that I referred earlier, they're also talking about freedom. So they are saying the freedom to choose a format that suits the need of the task at hand. So sounds nice. But freedom from dependence on specific applications, vendors, or platforms or exchange documents. In fact, that's precisely the reason why we need a standard. So they also speak our language. So how is this a reason for multiple standards is not clear though. Standards, according to them, are for the vendors. And you see that's the focus. So we talk about user, because for us, user is and we consider a vendor also as a user. So that's one important paradigm shift that happens in free software community. So everybody is a user. A government or an agency or a company or as a citizen, everybody is a user. So they forget that standard is a constraint to enable free document exchange and enhance the life of a digital document. They talk about freedom of vendors, forgetting the freedom of users. For example, let us take the case of why they say ODF is not enough for Office documents. In fact, this is one of the major arguments that ensued when the OOXML was in the process, ISO standardization process. They say ODF doesn't allow custom-defined data languages within the document format. When they are talking about custom, they're talking about customization by the vendor and not the user. ODF was made to eliminate custom data formats by developers and vendors. And they say that is what ODF prevents. This prevention is the reason why ODF exists or it is created. Should we say no to GNU Linux because it doesn't support the propagation of computer viruses? Their argument against ODF is precisely of this kind. Let me repeat, ODF and other open standards are constraints imposed on developers, not to use private encodings. Let us now talk about RAND. So RAND essentially is reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing. And so this is one of their arguments, saying that they want this amendment to be made in our Indian open standards document policy. So do we have a definition for what is reasonable? Or who interprets that? We don't have one. They will decide from case to case. And they want that freedom to decide from case to case. That's why they call it some kind of an ambiguous term like reasonable has been included in such a standard practices that are required in the legal and policy arena. So one of the conditions of an open document is to keep it completely royalty free. And that's precisely the reason why the OOXML and many other open standards. In fact, you would be surprised to know that ISO is one of the most popular standardization bodies. You would be knowing that if you start counting how many of the ISO standards are actually open standards, you will see that they're a minority. A very small number of ISO standards which are actually open standards. So that's why just calling something an ISO standard is not enough. So that's why policymakers have to actually keep an eye on whether that particular ISO standard actually is free of RAND, or is it also free of other private encumbrances, etc. An ISO standard doesn't mean it's an open standard. Most of ISO standards are not open standards. Then what is an open standard? So this is the definition that we normally give. And this definition, of course, is easily available, particularly if you go to FSF Europe site. This is basically borrowed from that. So an open standard must be collaboratively produced, and it's publicly assessed. And it should not have any kind of components that have dependencies on formats or protocols that do not meet the definition of an open standard itself. Free from legal or technical clauses that limit its utilization by any party or in any business model. An open standard is managed and further developed independently of any single vendor in a process open to equal participation and competitors and all parties. And it should be available in multiple complete implementations by competing vendors. Now, if we want to understand those who oppose open standards, we need to know how to make proprietary software. What is their logic? In fact, this will give you an idea about what is their game. The proprietary software is made by a simple process which I call the method of discretization. What they do is they separate the code from the decoder. So they give you the code, they allow you to keep the code with you, but they keep the right on the interpreter in their pocket. A proprietary vendor keeps the decoder with them, protected by a lock and key, and allows you to keep only the code, which is sterile without the decoder. So creating proprietary code is neither an invention nor an innovation, because code is arbitrary. Proprietary code, therefore, is a cheat. And a language which cannot be read by public cannot be used for public administration, as simple as that. And that's what we're asking essentially. Whether you are using it for a digital society or a non-digital society, you have to make sure that the human beings, whatever they produce, are never lost. Let me therefore repeat. A private proprietary language should be declared criminal by all civil societies. The purpose of this message is to convince the policymakers and all those who do e-governance to declare proprietary software and document formats a crime. Else, large companies will become mafias of the future digital society. Your intervention is therefore required for keeping the interpretation and code as close as possible and not to keep them separate. For that, use free library software. And that is the answer. Of course, there is one way to keep the code as well as interpretation as close as possible. If you use XML, For example,